History says civilization began 5,000 years ago. The stones disagree. This film walks calmly through 10 places that were too early, too advanced, or too organized for their time. Proof that complexity can arrive without kings, and that attention to stone, water, time is the first technology. Chapter 1. Göbekli Tepe, the first forgotten temple. In the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, where the land stretches out in quiet, sun-bleached waves, there lies a place that should not exist. A place older than history, older than farming, older than cities, older than anything we thought humans were capable of. For thousands of years, it slept beneath the earth like a buried memory, hidden, silent, waiting. The locals knew the hill. They called it Potbelly Hill. To them, it was just another mound of dirt and stone among many. But in 1994, when a simple shepherd noticed something strange, a piece of carved limestone sticking out of the soil, everything we believed about the rise of civilization began to unravel. Archaeologists arrived. They brushed away sand, dust, time itself. And what they found stunned the world. Massive stone pillars arranged in perfect circles, each pillar weighing up to 20 tons, some as tall as 18 feet, covered in intricate carvings of animals, lions, vultures, snakes, boars, so detailed and artistic that even modern sculptors were shocked. This was not random. This was not primitive. This was architecture. This was design. This was civilization. But there was a problem. Göbekli Tepe was 12,000 years old. Let that sink in. 12,000 years. That is 7,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 5,000 years before the first known city. According to everything we thought we knew, humans of that time were simple nomadic hunter-gatherers. No farming, no villages, no religion, no organization. And yet, someone gathered hundreds of people, shaped multi-ton stones, carved them with symbolic art, and arranged them into a massive ceremonial complex. This should have been impossible. To build something like this, you need planning, leadership, architecture, engineering, mathematics, astronomy, a shared belief system, a workforce, food surplus, social structure. But textbooks said none of that existed in 10,000 BC. Göbekli Tepe stood there quietly and whispered, "History is wrong," even more mysterious. It wasn't just one circle, it was dozens, layer upon layer, each older than the last. As excavators dug deeper, the structures became even more advanced. The oldest ones were the most complex. How does that make sense? Civilizations are supposed to start crude and get more sophisticated over time. But here, the pattern was reversed. It was as if someone began with greatness and then forgot. As if knowledge was inherited, not invented. And then, the greatest mystery of all. They buried it. Whoever built Göbekli Tepe eventually covered the entire complex with sand and gravel, sealing it deliberately, carefully, almost lovingly. Why would anyone bury their greatest achievement? Was it sacred? Was it dangerous? Was it being protected or hidden? Some believe it was a time capsule. Others think it marked the end of an era, an ancient world disappearing beneath Earth before a great change or a great disaster. And every year, new discoveries make the picture even stranger. Beneath the ground, using radar scans, archaeologists have detected over 20 more stone circles, still untouched. What we see today is less than 5% of the site, fewer than 5%, and it has already changed history forever. The carvings themselves hold secrets. The animals aren't random. Some match constellations in the sky, as they appeared 12,000 years ago. Meaning, Göbekli Tepe might have been built as a star map, a cosmic temple, a connection between Earth and the heavens. How did Stone Age humans understand astronomy with such accuracy? Who taught them? Where did this knowledge come from? No one knows. But one thing is clear. Göbekli Tepe should not exist. It is too old, too advanced, too perfect. It stands at the dawn of time, yet feels like the work of a mature civilization. Something came before us, something organized, something intelligent. And then, it vanished, leaving only these stones and questions older than memory. As the wind drifts over the silent pillars carrying the breath of forgotten ages, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Civilization did not begin where we thought. It began here, in the shadows of Göbekli Tepe, and perhaps even earlier. And this is only the beginning. For far beyond this lonely hill, across deserts and oceans, in places just as ancient and just as impossible, other civilizations were rising, civilizations that should not have existed. Chapter 2. Çatalhöyük, the rooftop city with no streets. In the heart of central Anatolia, where the plains stretch wide and pale beneath a quiet sky, a strange city once breathed, close and warm and low to the ground, like a living thing made of sun-baked clay. It had no streets. Instead, homes pressed against homes in a tight mosaic, walls kissing walls, roofs touching roofs, a honeycomb of human life. People moved across the top of their world, walking from one flat roof to the next, crossing invisible borders with soft steps and carrying baskets, firewood, obsidian blades. They descended into their homes by ladder through a square opening in the ceiling, as if returning gently into the body of the earth. Inside, rooms were intimate, white plastered walls that shone in the light of small fires, raised sleeping platforms smooth as bone, hearths where bread was baked and stories grew warm. In the corners, the dead rested beneath the floors. Grandparents and mothers, infants wrapped and laid in the home, kept close to the living so that memory had a place to sit each night. Time moved in layers here. When walls cracked or floors wore thin, they were repaired, replastered, renewed. When a house grew old, it was lovingly filled and sealed, and a new house rose on top of it, almost in the same shape, as if the settlement were exhaling and breathing itself back again. House upon house, century after century, a slow, steady heartbeat. They painted their walls. Ochres and charcoal traced leopards poised to leap, flocks of birds in black clouds, geometric patterns that pulsed like woven music. In some rooms, bullhorns, bucrania, were set into the walls, their heavy presence a quiet altar to strengthen plenty. On the floors, the fine dust of daily life gathered, seeds, ash, hairs of goats, the glitter of obsidian chips. The air tasted faintly of smoke and clay and bread. It should not have been possible at this time. Such density, such certainty, such urban grace. This place began around 7400 BCE, 1,000 years before many peoples would even dream of towns. And yet, Çatalhöyük, this soft, humming city of mud, brick, and meaning, was already a masterpiece of living together. There were no palaces here, no towering monuments, no grand temples with steps reaching toward the sun. If there were leaders, they left no thrones. If there were priests, they left no written laws. What remained instead were rooms that looked much the same, modest, repeating, equal, each with the tools of daily life. Grinding stones rubbed smooth by years of grain, hearths blackened by meal after meal, storage bins where the future waited patiently in seeds. The beauty hid in the pattern, a shared architecture, a shared rhythm. To navigate the city, one did not follow roads but followed roofs. To enter a home, one did not pass a door in the street but descended from the sky into the heart of the family. Privacy was not a wall, it was a ladder. Community was not a square, it was the roof beneath everyone's feet. They traded the dark glass of mountains, obsidian, sharp as thought, sending blades and mirrors along quiet networks that stretched far beyond the horizon. They tended sheep and goats. They harvested einkorn and barley. They shaped clay into figures, some of them round-bellied and serene, small goddesses of grain and birth, resting in palms like promises. And always the painting, the replastering, the renewing. A city in a constant state of gentle becoming. In one room, a famous image lingered on a wall, a village of small rectangles beneath two peaked shapes, the shapes streaked as if alive, perhaps a memory of nearby Hassan Dagh erupting, the white ash drifting down like winter that did not melt. Was it the world's first map? The story of a day the mountain roared? Or simply the dream of a painter who felt the earth breathe fire? Archaeologists searching for kings found kitchens. Seeking fortresses, they found floors replastered every season, walls retouched, household shrines rebuilt in familiar forms. Power, if it lived here, was distributed in 1,000 small rituals: the baking of bread, the cleaning of a hearth, the burial of a child cradled back into the soil that fed the wheat, that made the bread, that fed the people who tended the fire. A circle that closed gently, without monuments to announce itself. And yet, Çatalhöyük presses against our understanding as firmly as its houses pressed against one another. Urban density without streets, ritual without temples, craft specialization without visible hierarchy. A settlement that endured for many centuries, renewing itself in layers, as if the city were a living book written page over page, each generation writing in the same hand. Who decided how close the homes should stand? Who kept the peace when roofs were roads and your neighbor's footsteps crossed above your bed? Who chose when a house had grown old enough to be sealed, when memory should be folded and laid to rest? The city keeps its answers in silence. At dawn, one can imagine the roofs cool and pale, scattered with sleeping tools and baskets. The first fires spark and whisper. Far off, herds shift and stir. A ladder creaks. A woman emerges into the morning, carrying a bowl still warm from hands that shaped it yesterday. The air is full of low talk, of soft steps, of life beginning again in small, practiced gestures. Below the rooftops, beneath the plaster, beyond the packed fill of old rooms, the ancestors lie still and close, keeping the city grounded in its own past. And perhaps that is its secret. Çatalhöyük did not build upward toward a single power, but inward toward a shared memory, layer by layer, house by house, the city becoming an archive of itself. No triumphal gate, no royal statue, just the persistent tenderness of maintenance, the miracle of a community that chose to remain close. It should not have existed so early, so calmly sure of itself. Yet here it is, proof that civilization can be intimate, horizontal and quiet, an urban life without the shadow of a palace. As the sun climbs, the roofs warm. Dust drifts up in slow spirals. From the flat world of clay and light, the gaze can travel east, beyond the mountains and the open steppe, toward river valleys where geometry will take on a different form. Right angles marching in perfect lines, drains running under streets, bricks stamped to a single standard, cities tuned to water like instruments. There, on the floodplains of a distant land, another impossible vision takes shape. An urban world with planned grids, silent wells, and sewers beneath the feet of people who never built a king. The roofs of Çatalhöyük fade to the quiet hum of afternoon, and the story follows the wind toward the Indus. Chapter 3: Indus Valley, Cities. Tuned to water. On a flat, shimmering plain where rivers wander and change their minds, a quiet geometry once took root. Bricks, small, red, and perfectly proportioned, stacked into right angles that met like agreements. Streets ran straight and wide, crossing at measured intervals. Beneath them, unseen and steady, water moved through channels of fired clay and brick, guided, tamed, invited. They called none of this an empire. There were no triumphal gates carved with victories, no royal tombs to swallow the sky. And yet the plan was everywhere. In the rhythm of a drain, the spacing of a well, the way a street turned the corner as if following a calm rule. From Harappa to Mohenjo-Daro, from Dolavira to Lothal, the Indus cities seemed to hum in the same key, tuned to water, to cleanliness, to the comfort of order. Wells stood like punctuation in the neighborhoods, round throats lined with brick, bringing up coolness from the dark. In many homes, a small bathing space waited behind a low threshold, a floor sloped with care, a drain set just right to carry the wash away. Lanes ran with covered sewers, their lids removable for cleaning. Inspection holes punctured the runs at intervals, as if the city itself were a body that understood its own maintenance. It was not grand, but it was astonishing. stand in the mind's eye at Mohenjo-Daro as evening gathers. A soft rectangle of brick rises in the center, a complex we now call a citadel, though no army seems to have claimed it. Steps descend into a great pool lined with bitumen and brick. The surface barely ruffles. Whoever bathed here entered water that belonged to the city, to a ritual of cleanliness as public as it was private. Around the pool, rooms open like quiet witnesses. Nothing boasts, everything functions. The bricks themselves are standardized. Across a landscape larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, the ratio holds, length to width to height repeated like a remembered song. Weights, too, fall into regular steps, stone cubes that bring traders into agreement without argument, seals carved with animals and symbols, some of them a single-horned creature that seems both real and imagined, fit into the hand. Pressed into clay, they became signatures, permissions, the low murmur of commerce that joined inland cities to river ports and sea harbors. Somewhere across the water, Mesopotamian scribes wrote of ships from a place they called Meluha. The Indus answered without needing to write a single tablet we can read, for their script, if it is a script, remains closed to us. Brief strings of signs, strong, compact, beautiful, running along the tops of seals, on tablets the size of a palm, on tags that once hung from bales and jars. They do not speak in long lines. They do not shout a king's name. They keep their meanings short and guarded. Scholars argue, are these words, names, numbers, a system we do not yet recognize? The cities do not reply. Their silence feels deliberate. Inside certain rooms, beads catch the light, carnelian red as coals, agate banded like remembered rain, faience the color of shallow water. Workshops cut, drilled, polished, furnaces glowed. Hands knew how to make beauty repeatable. A tiny bronze dancer stands with one hip canted, an arm hung with bangles, alive in a still moment, relaxed and proud. A seated figure with a trellised robe and heavy-lidded eyes gazes forward from steatite, calm as the cities themselves. None of it claims to be a god, none of it claims to be a ruler, it simply is. Where are the palaces? If there were monarchs, they left no crowns we can be sure of. Where are the armies? If there were battles, the walls did not record them. The planning is the power here, the repeating block, the measured drain, the well within a few steps of most doors. Administration seems to have lived in brick and water rather than in a single throne. Authority, if it existed, felt like a standard carried in everyone's hand, a brick mold, a weight, a habit of cleanliness, a way to build so that strangers could share a city without colliding. At Lothal, a rectangle scooped from the earth lies near the old shoreline, a basin with sloped sides that smells of silt and salt even now. Some call it a dockyard. The tide may once have lifted boats in and out there, marrying river and sea to the city's grid. At Dolavira, reservoirs cut with care gather monsoon water along terraces of stone. Gateways open into a city plan that seems to inhale and exhale around its tanks, as if everything were measured in breaths of rain. Farther north, the ghosts of vanished channels score the land where a river, the Gagar Hakra, remembered in older names, once braided and unbraided, giving and withdrawing as climates shifted and courses failed. Decline came quietly. Not a fall, but a soft unthreading. Bricks still kept their ratios even as cities thinned. Wells still drew sweetness as neighborhoods emptied. Perhaps the rivers moved one step too far from their banks. Perhaps monsoons changed their mind, lingering less and leaving fields in thirst. Perhaps trade routes tilted. Perhaps nothing dramatic happened at all, only the long patience of climate at work, the kind of change that does not make a sound, only leaves. The cities did not burn, they loosened. People gathered elsewhere. The right angles stayed and waited for dust. What remains is a civilization that should not have been so early, so carefully complete. Urban planning before imperial pageantry, sanitation before monument, a city that thought first of flow, of water, of people, of waste, of air, and made its beauty from the logic of care. No grand inscriptions tell us how to read it. We are left with a feeling that tens of thousands lived here without the need to carve their leaders on the horizon. In the fading light, the grid softens. The drains once straight and sure, fill with wind-blown seeds. The great bath lies still. Somewhere, a bead tumbles in its jar. The bricks, faithful to their measures, hold their silence. The gaze turns west, across mountains and a long spine of coastline, over an ocean that breathes in long, heavy swells. On a high, dry coastal plain in a different hemisphere, another city lifts itself without armies, older than the pharaohs, older than the story we usually tell of the Americas. No weapons in its dust, no walls raised in fear, only pyramids and plazas, flutes and wind. The Indus geometry dims to embers, and the path continues along the shore of another riverless valley, toward Caral Supe. Yeti Chapter 4, Caral Supe. Pyramids without war. Along a dry ribbon of coast where the Pacific exhales cool fog inland each morning, a valley opens in terraces of pale earth and brittle grass. The Supe River runs thin but reliable here, threading green into a beige world, drawing life into the narrow cradle between desert and sea. Long before pharaohs raised their horizons of stone, long before kings carved names into rock, a city rose here out of wind and patience, quiet as breath, vast as a memory. Caral stands low and wide, its pyramids not sharp and defiant, but broad-shouldered, stepped and steady. Platforms of cut stone and river, cobble packed tight in woven shikra bags, layer upon layer, as if the people learned to stack the desert itself. Plazas open like held notes between the mounds, some sunk slightly into the earth, round and embracing, designed to gather voices and feed into a soft spiral of sound. Stairs climb with modest certainty. There are no walls to keep enemies out. There is room. The air carries 3 scents in turn: salt from the ocean, dust from the hills, and sweet water from the river. On the horizon, fog lifts in thin veils, and the early light lays a hand over the stone-like blessing. The city does not shout, it breathes. What the Spades did not find here is as important as what they did. There are no charred layers of conquest, no arrowheads scattered like teeth, no mass graves speaking of an end made by fire. Weapons, if they existed, did not write themselves into the earth of Caral. Instead, archaeologists drew up nets of reed and fiber, fishing tackle for anchovy and sardine. They lifted flutes of bone, their finger holes rubbed smooth by songs. They sifted textiles twisted from cotton, white, soft, and strong, threads that would carry trade and meaning along the dry spine of the coast. Imagine a morning in the plaza. Men and women descending the steps with baskets of gourd and bean, with bunches of dried fish, the solar weight of the day not yet heavy on their shoulders. A round amphitheater receives them with the hush of a shell. 2 or 3 begin to play, breath turning bone into music, a thin silver sound that rises and curls against the mound. Children stoop to gather pebbles, tracing lines. Traders arrive from up the valley with squash and chili, from down the coast with salt and fish, from farther inland with odd stones that glint in ways the locals like to hold in their palms. People stand and listen. People measure and trade. Somewhere, a priest, or simply a keeper of time, raises an arm to the sun, not to command, but to keep count. The pyramids grow by accumulation, by care. Shikra bags, tight baskets woven of plant fiber, hold cobbles in place so fill does not shift when stacked. Crews move methodically in teams, voices pass instruction along the steps, feet stamp new steps into the dust. An offering is tucked into a layer, shells, a small carving, a cluster of fine reeds, then buried. Under the next lift. Construction here is ritual, and ritual is construction. The city remakes itself piece by piece, season after season, patient and exact. Their river gives a lesson and a limit. The Supe is no Nile. It cannot be commanded, only courted. Canals are small and clever, not grand. Fields step back from the bank with respect. Windbreaks rise where the desert threatens to move. Cotton fields whiten at harvest, like a low, quiet snowfall. Gourds swell modestly. Beans keep their green. From sea to field, an economy flows that is measured more in rhythm than in surplus. Fish for fiber, fiber for nets, nets for fish. an elegant circle that links the cold ocean's generosity to the warmth of human hands. Caral should not be this old. 5,000 years melt away here, and still the plazas sit ready. While pyramids lifted on the Nile's black silt, while Sumer wrote law into the mud, this coast already gathered people in planned spaces, already poured effort into architecture that served meeting more than mastery. If there were rulers, they left no high-voiced stelae, no jagged claims against the sky. Authority hides in alignments and terraces, in the way a stair faces the solstice sunrise, in the way a plaza draws a circle that fits a harvest's worth of dancers, in the way the city's heart beats where sound collects. They counted time. Fire pits blackened and refilled with offerings at measured intervals. Some walls catch the sun just so on certain days. Some corridors hold shadow that shortens and lengthens like a breath you can see. Music, too, may have kept the calendar. Line up the flutes of pelican and condor bone, and the tones step in slender order, a ladder the ear can climb from season to season. In the evening, when the winds settle and the light thins to copper, imagine sound drifting over the river's small rush, threading stone to field to sea. Trades stretched farther than the eye could see from any pyramid top. Spondylus shells reddened from warm northern currents found their way here, treasured for color and ritual depth. Farther inland, in high valleys and cold, other hands spun camelid fiber into rope and cloth that would move down to the coast. Up the shore, other towns lifted platforms and traced their own circles. Caral is not an island, but a hub, a soft knot in a loose net, civilization expressed as relation, not conquest. Why here? Why then? Perhaps the Humboldt Current's icy richness made surplus from the sea simple enough that people could turn labor towards stone and ceremony. Perhaps cotton, humble, white, and infinitely useful, was an engine hidden beneath the obvious glamour of pyramids, the plant that turned nets into food and fiber into leverage. Perhaps a priestly class rose and fell with the river's patience and the sea's certainty, guiding the city by ritual obligation more than coercion. Or perhaps the story is quieter still. 1,000 small agreements renewed each season. None of them sharp enough to cut the earth with iron or fire. Decline, when it came, carried the shape of drought. Rivers sulk when the mountains dry out. Channels that once braided gleefully narrow to a single grudging thread. Terraces crack. The wind removes what the hands had carefully placed. Caral did not burn. It loosened. People moved upriver, downriver, elsewhere, following water as they always had. The flutes fell silent, not broken. The plazas emptied, but did not accuse. Walk the mounds now, and the desert presses up to your ankles, patient and granular. A lizard darts over a step that once knew 1,000 feet. The amphitheater holds an old echo, as if keeping a promise. The sun leans down and proves alignments that no one announces aloud. The city remains not as a boast, but as a pose. One knee bent, arms open, ready to receive. A civilization without war at its center, pyramids without kings, music without interruption, planning without prison. Caral should not exist at the root of the America's story, older than the empires taught in school, already composed, already social, already architectural. And yet it does. And in its quiet, it argues for another kind of beginning, one where the first monument is not a blade or a wall, but a place to stand together and listen. As the valley's evening comes on, the Pacific pulling fog back ashore like a blanket, the light slides along terrace edges and gathers in the round plaza until it seems a bowl full of dusk. In that gathering softness, the path of this story lifts away from the river and the sea. It climbs inland, then across an ocean of sand, where another circle of stones met the sky long before pharaohs took their crowns, where the desert held a calendar and the stars came down to touch the earth in shadow and line. Caral's breath slows to a coastal hush, and the journey turns east across continents and ages, toward Nabta Playa. Chapter 5. Nabta Playa, where the desert remembered the sky. Far to the south of Egypt's familiar monuments, beyond the Nile's green ribbon and the soft hiss of reed beds, the land opens into a high, wind-quiet plateau. Here the Sahara spreads like an ocean, paused mid-breath, dunes stilled in their long migration, gravel plains holding heat like old thoughts. In this wide silence lies a dry basin that once held water, a shallow lake that came and went with the summer monsoon. They called such places Playas, bowls for the rain to rest in before returning to cloud and distance. Long ago, when the desert was less certain of itself, people gathered at one of these bowls. They left stones behind that still talk to the light. Nabta Playa is not grand at first glance. No towering pylons, no carved names. A few weathered slabs stand upright, the taller ones only a little higher than a person. Nearby, low clusters of stones draw circles and lines upon the earth. To the untrained eye, it is almost nothing, the way the first notes of a song can seem like a pause. But when the sun moves, the stones answer. When the seasons turn, the arrangement declares its purpose. What survives is simplicity and intention, a calendar set down in rock where water once gathered. The people who came here were pastoralists, moving with cattle between places with names now lost to dust. They carried gourds and grain, bone and flint. In the short season when the lake filled and the grass lifted its head, they made camp along the shore and set their dead in low mounds they smoothed with care. At evening, when the heat fell back into the ground and the sky lifted its dark curtain, they watched the same constellations we name now, though their stories were different. Their hands placed stones so that the heavens would have a counterpart on earth. Some slabs marked solstice lines. When the sun reached its highest north, a shadow fell just so. When it slid far south in winter, another alignment woke. In a small, tight ring, the calendar circle scholars like to name, 4 thin uprights once framed the light's passage, a geometry for the year's return. At a distance, taller megaliths stand in avenues as if conducting a careful procession toward the playa's heart. Taken together, the layout is both map and memory, a way to know when rains might come, a way to honor the sky that keeps the promise. Wind is the master here, and time its apprentice. Yet the stones have a stubbornness that weather respects. Their faces are roughened by sand, their edges softened, their bases rooted in a ground that remembers wet seasons like a taste. The very fact of their endurance bends the mind. These alignments are older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. They stand at the lip of deep time, where the desert we know was still learning to be itself. Archaeologists reading the site in fragments found more than astronomy in the dust. Pit circles once held offerings, low. Tumuli guarded burials. And in places, cattle bones, skulls given attention, horns arranged with care, hint at ritual shaped around herd and season. Across North and Northeast Africa, there runs an old thread of reverence for cattle, an acknowledgement of the animal's place in survival and ceremony alike. At Nabta, that thread lies close to the surface. One can imagine a dry season vigil around a shrinking waterhole, a small fire built of thorn, a song for endurance pressed into the wind. There are larger stones too, hauled from distances that mean labor and intention. Some stand alone, sentinels keeping watch over an emptiness that once held green. Their arrangement draws long lines that scholars trace to stars, most famously to a belt of 3 that stride the sky together. Whether those lines were meant to fix a myth to a horizon, or to anticipate a season, or simply to anchor story to landscape, no inscription explains. The stones only continue to stand and make their quiet case. It should not be here, this observatory without walls, this temple that is almost a diagram. Or rather, it should not be so early. The habit of putting the heavens into the earth, of calibrating living by sky, feels at home in the great stone rings of the far north, in the axis of temples along the Nile, in cities where sun and shadow stage their theater across courts and columns. At Nabta, the gesture appears in spare form, with no king to claim it and no city to hold it. Pastoralists set their measures in rock, and then left and returned and left again, trusting the desert to remember for them. Their world was one of cycles held on a thin edge. When the monsoon pushed north, grass returned and the lake spread out like a shallow mirror. The cattle filled and gave milk. Children ran the hard crust at the playa's edge, while cloud towers built over the southern horizon, promising. Then the rains withdrew. The lake shrank back. Dust began to settle on stones, on footprints, on memory. To live well in such a place required a pact with time. The stones wrote that pact in a grammar of shadow and line. There is humility in the site's scale and audacity in its idea. To ask light where you are in the year, without script, without city, without empire, is to say that knowledge belongs to those who pay attention. A narrow slot between two uprights becomes a declaration. This is the turning. A line through two megaliths becomes a reminder. Watch here, and you will know when to gather, when to move, when to hope. In the morning, low sun runs its hand along the stone edges. At noon, it reduces everything to exclamation marks. At evening, it stretches their shadows long across the playa, reconnecting each upright to the horizon it points toward. Decline here is the simplest story and the hardest. Climate changed. The monsoons retreated south by degrees so small a single lifetime might not notice, but centuries did. The lake returned less generously, then reluctantly, then not at all. Grass gave way to gravel, then to hardpan and the thin rasp of wind. Camps appeared less often, offerings ceased. The pact could not be held if the sky would not keep its share. The pastoralists took their herds elsewhere. The stones stayed, performing their alignments for no one. Walk among them now, and the silence is dense enough to hear. Heat stacks itself in layers. The horizon draws a lean, unbroken line. A lark might lift and vanish into glare. A beetle might leave the smallest script in sand. The stones cast their patient shapes and receive the same attention from the light they once did when laughter and lowing arranged themselves around the lake's edge. Even in absence, purpose remains legible. Nabta Playa should not be as old as it is, as assured as it is, as elegant in its economy. It asks us to recognize civilization in the slenderest of signatures, a few stones set right, a dead remembered, a season called by its correct name. It suggests that architecture did not always begin with shelter or boast, but sometimes with orientation, a way to stand in a shifting world and say, now. As evening slides across the plateau and the shadows lengthen into a drawn breath, the desert gives back the day's color slowly. The stones take on a softness that morning does not allow. Above them, the sky rehearses the old procession in an order it keeps whether watched or not. Somewhere far to the north, the Nile coils toward its own ceremonies. Farther still, temples will frame solstices with precision and pride. But here, at the quiet edge, the first handwriting of that tradition survives. The gaze lifts with the dark. Across an ocean and a different humidity, in forests heavy with rain, and along rivers that brown their banks with life, an older riddle waits. The face of a people we do not fully understand, staring from stone, features broad and calm, lips closed as if keeping a vow. They, too, raised monuments before empires announced themselves, heads so large the earth had to help carry them, symbols so certain they need no caption. The playa exhales. Night takes the basin. The path of this story turns west, toward jungles and floodplains and coasts where rubber and jade learned new names, toward the Olmecs. Chapter 6. The Olmecs. Faces in stone, voices in silence. Where the land of southern Mexico folds into low hills and river marsh, where the air is thick with green and the ground remembers every step with water, a people once shaped their world with a certainty that left no need for explanation. They did not carve long histories in walls. They did not write a king's deeds where the horizon could read them. They left faces. Colossal heads rise from the earth at San Lorenzo and La Venta. Basalt helmets, broad features, lips pressed as if holding a secret. Each face is individual, a crease at the mouth, a curve at the cheek, a gaze turned inward and outward at once. Some weigh as much as a small house. They were cut far from where they now rest, dragged or rolled from volcanic slopes, floated along rivers swollen with the season, lifted with ropes and human rhythm onto platforms of packed earth. The effort itself is a declaration. These are not stones that wandered by accident, they are decisions. Around the heads, the ground takes shape in quiet geometry. Earthen mounds rise with intention, not sharp like later pyramids, but broad, layered, and stable. Platforms that hold memory like open hands. At La Venta, a ceremonial core assembles itself from low pyramids and plazas, a layout aligned not to a single boast, but to directions and cycles. Jade mosaics lie buried like offerings to the earth's skin, a green skin upon a brown one. Serpents and masks arranged, then covered, as if what matters most is not display but completion. The Olmecs knew how to move water. San Lorenzo is cut and formed with channels and drains, the ground teased into plains that guide rain and overflow. Basalt-lined gutters vein the site like a physiology. Reservoirs rest where the hand would place a cup on a table. In a place where too much water is as dangerous as too little, control is an art as noble as any. The art leaves few words. It speaks in slope and depth, in a lip of stone where water changes its mind, in a spillway that admits the season and refuses the flood. Their hands worked hard stone into softness. Jade, serpentine, basalt, materials that resist, yielded to polish and edge. Tiny figures tilt their heads, mouths downturned, eyes half-lidded, infants and adults at once. The so-called were jaguar visage, an expression pressed into ceramic and stone, a language of teeth and tears and transformation. Masks appear that were not necessarily worn but offered, pure faces held to the world for a time, then laid away. In caves and swamps, in places where the land breathes between water and stone, they left things that mattered and did not return to retrieve them. They played a game whose bounce outlasted empires. Rubber, coaxed from trees with cuts and skill, was made to leap, to carry force through air, to define courts with nothing but lines and rules and the give of a ball. The ball game is older than many cities, and in Olmec hands it is already ritual, a contest that binds players to directions, time to movement, victory to meaning. The court is not a stadium, but a calendar drawn in sweat, trade traveled by river and footpath and memory. From the Motagua Valley, jade came, clouds of green trapped in stone. Obsidian, dark and keen, arrived from high places. Shell crossed from coasts, iron ore glinted in the hands that made mirrors. A figurine of jade might lie in a swamp that never saw a jade-bearing stream. A mask of polished iron might flash a sun in a forest where sun rarely touches ground. The network is not a road you can map, but a habit you can see. Objects appearing where they were not born, meanings moving with them. They may have written. A tablet of serpentine, the Cascachal block, carries rows of signs carved and rearranged, a sequence no one now reads. Short inscriptions appear here and there, symbols that repeat like instruments in a song whose melody is lost. If this is script, it is among the first in the Americas, a whisper on stone, a voice too low to catch after the choir has gone quiet. The Olmecs do not argue the case, they keep the habit of brevity. If there were rulers, they remain present and unnamed. Thrones, great stone seats, lie half-buried, carved with figures emerging from cave mouths, infants held like promises or threats, men bound, jaguars near at hand. In one monument, a leader leans forward, a rope in his grip. In another, a figure sits within a niche, the whole itself a mouth of earth, the person both separate from and born of landscape. Authority is staged in Earth's language, caves, mountains, animals, rain. It is less decree than arrangement, less command than alignment with things larger than any hand. Why do these cities feel older than their dates, more assured than their context? The atmosphere answers. The Gulf lowlands are generous and restless, a place where the ground slides underfoot if ignored, where rivers redraw themselves with monsoon logic, where rot and growth trade roles in hours. To build here is to negotiate with a world that proliferates. The Olmec solution is not defiance, but choreography. Platforms that lift the human world above the wet, drains that accept water and send it elsewhere, plazas that provide a dry mathematics in the middle of a rainforest sentence, alignments that teach direction to a canopy that always trends toward everywhere. Decline arrives without a trumpet. San Lorenzo wanes, La Venta waxes, then it too softens. Mounds flatten back toward plain, channels silt and fill. The old centers release their labor into the wider landscape, and the style, the faces, the jaguars, the way Earth can be persuaded to hold a shape, continues in new cities with new names. Olmec is our word, not theirs. A label stretched over centuries and regions to describe a pulse that moves from place to place, rather than a state that stands in one spot and declares itself. What we call influence is sometimes simply the way a good idea behaves when conditions are right. Stand before a head at Tres Zapotes, or at the park at La Venta, where the jungle tries to resume its sentence and the stone interrupts. The eyes, carved, shadowed, the depth of the lids exaggerated by time's own sandpaper, look beyond the viewer in a direction both specific and undefined. The helmets fit the skulls like ideas. The lips pressed together not in anger, but in concentration. The monument is not a portrait in the modern sense, yet it is more than a symbol. Personality rides the mass like a small boat. If names were spoken when these stones were unveiled, the air kept them and did not return them to us. It should not be this coherent so early, this assured, this mobile. A civilization that can carry its ceremonial heart in baskets of soil and lay it out anew 100 kilometers away. It can lift mountains in pieces and give them faces, that can tune ground and water without covering either in stone. Yet, here it is. The Olmecs stand at the headwaters of Mesoamerican time, not because they imposed themselves forever, but because they showed how a world might be made to listen, to rain, to direction, to season, to stone. Evening comes fast in the tropics. Heat unhooks itself from the day and climbs, leaving the ground damp with its passing. A chorus begins in the trees. On a platform, a court grows quiet. Somewhere a jade bead flashes once and then is gone. Somewhere a drain takes a last thin ribbon of water and delivers it to a place designed to receive. The colossal face watches nothing and everything. The mouth holds its line. The secret survives. Across the sea, on an island where hills break the horizon like waves turn to rock, another people learned to make their cities breathe. They stacked stories from timber and plaster and stone and let light run along painted walls. Water obeyed their pipes and drains, ships stitched their harbors into the wider world, and in fresco, bulls flew. The heads in the forest remain, and the gaze turns east, past open water and the underlight of waves, toward a palace with open doors and rooms that inhale, toward the Minoans. Chapter 7. The Minoans. Houses that breathed, seas that spoke. In the middle of the wine-dark Aegean, where islands rise from water like thoughts given shape, a civilization built homes that inhaled. Corridors opened to courtyards, stairwells lifted light from one floor to the next. Rooms spread themselves around air and shadow as if architecture were a gentle animal learning to breathe. On Crete, at Knossos and Phaistos and Malea and Zakros, the Minoans compose space the way others compose music. Phrases of light, rests of coolness, recurring motifs of red columns and white stone, all tuned to wind and season. There are no fortress walls at Knossos in its confident years, only terraces cascading down a slope, porticos standing on columns that taper downward like trunks of trees, and courts where feet once learned the map of a sacred dance. Doorways do not end in doors, but in wooden frames that could be folded aside so that rooms joined one another like sentences made larger by commas. Light wells pour day into the middle of things. Pierced windows teach shade to behave as ornament. Water arrives in clay pipes, descends in drains lined with stone, vanishes with ceremony but without fuss. To step into these spaces is to feel a climate made by hand. The walls remember color. Frescoes return the sea to the house, dolphins in blue fields, fish schooling with the calm certainty of pattern, lilies that bend as if remembering wind. Girls leap with long hair loose and long hands sure, boys race, bullhorns curve upward like a sign you can learn but never fully read. Red and black and white and blue arrange themselves in borders and panels. Even ruin keeps a little of the radiance. Where plaster survives, it lifts the eye. Where it's gone, one can still feel the habit of brightness. They sailed. The sea was not a border, but a road, and their ships stitched Crete to the Cyclades, to the Peloponnese, to Anatolia, to Egypt, to Levantine coasts. In harbors where the water shoals from dark to pale, anchors bumped stone quays, and crews stepped ashore with amphora of oil, with jars of wine, with copper ingots shaped like hides. Obsidian came from Melos, tin from distances with many names, faience and scarabs from the Nile world, blue stone from places that made blueness a resource, ideas from everywhere. The island learned a fluent language of exchange. Their writing kept its secrets close. On clay tablets and ceilings, signs in quick rows, linear A, took stock and set names in the small authority of impressions. We read the rhythm, but not the words. Later, a different hand, linear B, will speak of rations and flocks in a Greek that belongs to a different age. But in the years when palaces opened their doors to wind, the script remains an unspilled vessel. Administration lived in storerooms where paithoi, their huge storage jars, stood in ranks like patient giants, bellies filled with oil and grain and promise. The smell of olive and resin would have been a constant note under the sharper music of the sea. Religion inhabits thresholds and horns and trees. Double axes appear in shrines, not to split wood, but to divide air into meaning. Sacred horns, the stylized tips of a bull, crown walls and parapets. A small platform holds a model tree, and offerings arrange themselves at its feet. Goddesses lift their arms, serpents wind up their wrists, birds land with the abstraction of symbol on hats and branches. In cave and peak sanctuary, in rooms with benches and pillars impressed with marks that might be letters and might be prayer, attention gathers. Ritual is not thunderous here. It is iterative, domestic, bright. Everything feels early and mature at once, as if complexity were allowed to arrive without the usual training in war. The Minoan world gives us palatial planning without palisades, drainage without triumphal claims, art that treats animals as companions in motion, not trophies suspended in victory. Authority reads as choreography, procession along corridors, storage divided and labeled, seating that faces a courtyard where things happen in the open, not behind a throne. If there were kings, they seldom shout from stone. If there were queens, they walk in fresco with bare breasts and high skirts, more myth than decree, more presence than command. In the central court at Knossos, the ground holds a rectangle of anticipation. Here the bull leapers lived their moment, a ritual so often painted, it begins to seem like remembrance rather than invention. A bull charges, hands find horn or back, bodies arc, feet touch down. Whether this was sport or prayer or both, the frescoes refuse to tell us where fear ended and grace began. The bull's back becomes a stage. The human body becomes a sentence with a verb as precise as flight. Trade and craft supported this elegance. In workshops where light fell sideways, potters turned clay into cups that balanced delicacy with use. Painters traced octopuses whose arms found every curve of a vessel and made it look inevitable. Stonecutters drilled and polished rock crystal and serpentine and gypsum until they felt almost wet in the hand. Bronze took edges that looked like decisions. Even the mortars of their walls learned endurance. Nothing here hurries, and nothing lingers without purpose. Then the ground moved. On the island of Thera, far to the north, a mountain opened itself and threw half its body into the sky. Ash climbed, fell, climbed again. Pumice rode the sea until it knocked on other islands. A caldera drank an entire summit. Whether the eruption alone injured the Minoans or only set a sequence in motion, the record in earth and ruin reads like a series of breaths caught and released in different places at different times. Tsunami may have run fingers along north coast towns. Trade shivered, palaces burned and were rebuilt, then burned again. A culture that had trusted in doors and air wells learned what it meant to patch and to try again. By the time Mycenaean hands begin to hold the seals, Crete's old grammar softens. Linear B finds its place in inventories where Linear A once kept counsel. Courts continue to measure sunlight, storerooms rank their jars, but the voice is not the same, and the story widens away from the island's own articulation. Knossos breathes still, but the breath is borrowed. Walk the site in late afternoon, when touristic hours thin and the wind returns to the habit of moving through doorways made for it. The red columns seem to deepen into themselves. The plaster, even where replaced, remembers the idea of color. The steps know how feet pass one another when a procession holds itself together without harsh instruction. Look down a light well and feel the mild drama of shade rising to meet the eye. Touch the stone lip of a drain and understand water's spiral. The place teaches by showing, not by telling. It should not have been this poised so early, this secure in its lack of walls, this invested in the happiness of air and water. And yet on Crete, civilization tried a variant, one where comfort is a civic good, where beauty is public, where administration is clean storage and clear passage and careful counting, where religion takes form as an arrangement of open space and horns and trees, not a boundary marked by fear. Even its catastrophes read like weather more than conquest. Evening gathers over the Aegean. Ferries leave white wakes that widen and vanish. Swifts turn above the roofs that no longer hold their beams. Somewhere a shard of marine-style pottery holds an octopus in linework so supple it could still swim. The palaces receive the dark with the same competence they received daylight, and the island returns to the sea's wider order. Far away, on another chain of islands along a continent's edge, a different miracle kept its pace. Without kings or palaces, without metal at first, a people with time and patience shaped clay into vessels older than agriculture itself. They pressed cord and shell into wet surfaces to make patterns the hand still recognizes. They placed pots in earth ovens and ate by rivers and coasts where fish returned with the season. Their settlements learned ritual not by monument, but by repetition that stretched over millennia. Crete exhales. Night fills its courts. The path crosses open water on a map of thought, north and far east, to a Japan where an ancient culture did not hurry toward cities, but still made time permanent with clay. Toward the Jōmon. Chapter 8. Jōmon. Time written in clay. Along coasts braided with inlets and pine, where fog moves like a soft animal between islands and river mouths, widen into patient bays. A people lived with time long enough to make it visible. They did not hurry toward cities or kings. They caught fish when fish returned, gathered chestnuts when trees remembered to give, hunted in forests that kept their own counsel, and sat beside hearths where clay learned to hold a curve. Their name, given later, is an artifact of touch. Jōmon, cord-marked. Before fields were squared and oxen yoked in many other places, Jōmon hands were lifting vessels from earth and fire. Some of the earliest pots on the planet cooled in this archipelago 15,000 years ago. Thick-bodied, low-fired, good for simmering shellfish and roots, for keeping a stew's memory overnight. Wet clay took impressions from rope, from woven mat, from fingernail, textures pressed in while the pot still breathed. A thumbprint here, a twist there, a signature of season and camp. The style changed as centuries unspooled. In some periods, rims rose and flared into flame. Kayan doki, vessels crowned with frozen motion, dramatic as surf. In others, surfaces kept to quiet cord and comb. What did not change was the intimacy. every pot a negotiation between hand, heat, and use. Decoration did not float above function. It was the record of making itself. Settlements gathered where food cycles converged, estuaries, lakes, river terraces. Houses went into the ground part way, pit dwellings with ring posts and thatch, warm in winter, cool under summer sun. Burials lay close by, sometimes with shell bracelets or a dog buried as carefully as a person. Middens, the honest archives of meals, rose in crescents and mounds that now read like books: oyster, clam, scallop, fish bones and boar, nutshell and seed. Tools tuned themselves to place: polished stone for axes, bone and antler for fishhooks and harpoons, needles for sewing, weights for nets worked in tidal mathematics. The rhythm held for millennia. That word is often said too quickly. Here it must be counted. 10,000 years of variation on a theme: camp, gather, fish, hunt, fire clay, bury the dead, return to the inlet, return to the chestnut grove, mend the net, twist the cord, press the cord into the wet rim. A calendar not of conquest, but of recurrence. Ritual lived at household scale and in circles where feet learned paths. Stone rings, stone circles, appear in highlands and along river plains, ovals and rounds laid out with boulders in careful patterns. In summer, the sun threads those patterns in ways that suggest intention. Alignments hint at solstices, at gatherings keyed to light. Small figurines, dog, shape themselves from clay with eyes like seeds or goggles, limbs thick and patterned, bellies sometimes marked as swollen. Many are broken deliberately and placed in the ground, as if giving back to earth what was asked of it in protection or healing. The figures do not sermonize, they register care. The sea taught a curriculum both generous and exacting. Salmon ran, sardine shoals darkened water, tuna patrolled edges where currents argued. Offshore, islands gave obsidian, black, conchoidal, keen, napped into points that could find muscle cleanly. Inland, lacquer's gloss arrived after long practice. Sap gathered drop by patient drop, filtered, applied in layers that hardened into a quiet sheen on wood and cord. In winter, snow spoke in muffled grammar. In summer, cicadas wrote long sentences in air. The people answered by doing the next necessary thing well. Jōmon is often named hunter-gatherer, as if that were a single note. Here the chord is richer. Chestnut and acorn orchards were tended, groves curated over generations, trees favored and spread so that mast fell where humans camped. Wetland edges were managed, fish weirs set, shellfish beds revisited with care that looks like governance. Dogs were companions in work and burial both. The line between wild and domesticated blurs into a relationship tuned by time rather than decree. And then there is the duration again. Civilizations elsewhere rise, centralize, carve, insist, and fall, sometimes in less time than the Jōmon spent perfecting a rim profile. The astonishment here is continuity. A material culture recognizable across vast distances and longer spans than most traditions endure, evolving, localizing, absorbing climate's long moods, yet still itself. The archipelago changed, coastlines rearranged with post-glacial sea levels, forests shifted their cast, people adjusted without abandoning the grammar of their lives. The script remains unwritten in the narrow sense. No long lines of characters survive to narrate law or lineage. The writing is in cord and ash, in the cross-section of a shell mound, in a village plan that repeats a conversation between house and wind. The message is pragmatic and aesthetic at once. Make what you need, mark it with what you have. Let beauty be consequence and intention together. Late Jōmon years grew leaner in places as climate tilted, cooler, drier. Plants and animals reconsidered their ranges. Populations thinned or moved. Homeland shifted within homeland. Into the following Yayoi period came rice, bronze, iron, new hierarchies and fields, set in rectangles that drain and shine. The long breath of Jōmon does not so much end as resolve into a different key. Yet the habit of attention, of crafting the everyday until it becomes quietly extraordinary, persists in the archipelago's deeper muscle memory. Hold a Jōmon pot in a museum's still air, and it fights the glass with its warmth. The cord marks are not decoration from above. They are the memory of a net, of a rope that also pulled fish, tied bundles, bound roof and raft. The vessel records a life lived with material honesty, and it does not apologize for the time it took. The object is a sentence you can read with your hand. It should not be so early, so perfected without palaces, so patient without script or king. And yet across isthmuses of time, this culture insists that civilization can be measured by the refinement of the ordinary, by the endurance of pattern, by how well people in place converse when neither tries to dominate the other. Evening fog returns, laying gray silk between cedar and shore. A fire pits its orange against the soft weather. A pot ticks as it cools. Somewhere in a ring of stone, the last light threads a gap that once meant now. The sea breathes, and the village breathes with it. Far across continents of steppe and river, another lineage built in stone with an assurance that seems to start at maturity. Pyramids rose not in Egypt alone, but south of the cataracts, where desert meets savanna, and kings wore crowns that faced upstream. Queens ruled in their own names, iron chimed on anvils, and on the horizon of sand, a forest of sharp silhouettes, pyramids small and many, cut the dusk. The clay cools, the view lifts along the Nile's upper course toward the kingdom of Kush. Chapter 9. Kingdom of Kush. Pyramids. Facing upstream. South of Egypt's familiar horizons, where the Nile tightens between rock and then loosens into long green breaths, a different lineage of stone took shape. Desert gives way to savanna here, and the river steps down through cataracts that make the water speak aloud. On these banks, kings looked north toward empires that wrote their names in hieroglyphs in granite, and then wrote their own in a script still quiet to us. Their pyramids stand not in lonely handfuls, but in small forests of sharp silhouettes, each one slender as a drawn spear, each one learning to hold light at a steeper angle. This was Kush. At Nabta, beneath the pale mass of Jebel Barkal, the river curves with a deliberate grace. The mountain rises like a sign the sky put down and left, its cliff a stage for shadow, its spur like a finger pointing to memory. Temples gathered there, columns and pylons echoing Egypt's grammar, yet speaking with local breath. Farther downstream, at Meroe, the land opens and hardens, iron sings on anvils, smoke remembers the shape of furnaces. Between these hearts, towns and fields learned the Nile's moods, and caravans stitched the river to the Red Sea and to deserts, where gold keeps its counsel. The pyramids are smaller than Egypt's and more numerous. Their sides climb steeply, their tips end in capstones that once gleamed. At their base, chapels hold reliefs where kings and queens meet gods with composure. Sand drifts against the lower courses like a quiet audience. Stand among them, and the eye learns a new repetition. Point, shadow, an agreement with the sun written again and again. Horses, prized and keen, sometimes went into the earth with their rulers, trappings intact, as if the journey needed old speed. Kush faced Egypt first as a student, then as a ruler, then as a neighbor who would not be erased. When northern dynasties faltered, Nubian kings moved upriver and took the crowns, Pai first, then others, reuniting the Nile under a black granite certainty that flowed from south to north. For a time, the two lands answered to voices from Nabta. Sandstone walls record tall figures in kilt and crown, calm before gods who wore falcon and ibis and lion. When empires shifted again, the court returned south, and Meroe took the weight of years. Here the style sharpened, here the script changed its face. On sherd and stone, on funerary lintel and votive, Meroitic signs walk in measured rows, cursive, demotic, carved. We sound some names now, but the language keeps its interior. An alphabet was not enough to give us meanings without the key. The script is a beautiful barricade, and behind it, daily life continues. Accounts tallied, offerings noted, titles written that no one living can claim to understand aloud. We read presence without translation, as if listening through a wall to a conversation we recognize as intimate. Iron rooted itself in this soil as if it had found its climate. North of Meroe, slag heaps lift their low hills, the refuse of smelting piled until it became landscape. Bellows wheezed, charcoal gave up its stored forests to heat, ore turned red, then brown, then metal. Blades and points left workshops for field and hunt, chisels bit stone. Trade carried weight in both sense and substance. The city learned the smell of hot iron the way coastal towns learned salt as identity. Gods wore faces both borrowed and born here. Amun found new ground beneath Jebel Barkal. Isis and Osiris made long journeys upriver, but a lion god with 3 heads, a Pedamak, claimed Meroe's temples with a vigor that feels local and exact. On the walls at Naka he strides, conqueror and patron, yet his gaze is not cruel. Queens and kings approach gods without shrinking. The posture is assured, a state with its own breath, not a culture echoing forever. Queens ruled. Kandaks stand with staff and collar, their bodies rendered in a fullness that reads as presence, not merely ornament. Amanirenas faces the north and does not yield. When Rome's legions tested the border's shape, Kush met them on its own terms. Temples struck and striking back, forts measured to resist, a negotiation conducted with iron and stone and time. The story is not one of defeat hurried into footnote. It is of a country that knew where it stood and how long standing matters. In the necropolises, reliefs show the dead meeting gods with hands raised in adoration, with offerings of bread and beer, with the calm that comes from ritual's rehearsal. Beneath those images, tunnels dropped to chambers that held bodies wrapped and placed with attention. Gold leaf once rested on certain faces, beads lay across chests in cooled rivers of color. Amulets kept their geometric prayers. Above, the small pyramids kept watch. Wind drew lines in sand that the builders could not have failed to notice. Dunes are cartographers who work in days and centuries both. It should not feel this complete so far from the canonical centers of classrooms, this self-possessed, this literate, in a voice that refuses translation. Yet here was a kingdom that took Egypt's vocabulary and conjugated it differently, that wore crowns with serpents and feathers, and meant what it said, that invested in iron until it sang the city's name. Roads ran east to ports that faced Arabia. Ivory, ebony, gold, and animals moved outward. Glass and wine and rumor returned. Between cataracts, fields considered the rise of water and the reach of the Shaduf, and declined to hurry. Decline is not a single event. Trade shifts its lines. Deserts advance like discussions that exhaust. Oxum rises across the Red Sea and extends a hand heavy with consequence. The river keeps its own counsel. Meroe dims, not erased but distributed into later names. The pyramids lose their tips to those who came for treasure and left geometry wounded. Even so, the necropolises keep their forest of angles, and the chapels keep their reliefs, and a lion-headed god remains mid-stride on a wall that still knows noon. Walk there at first light, before heat straightens everything. The pyramids are silhouettes, then structures, then the color of bread. Sand presses around ankles and murmurs. A scarab skates its arc. The chapels face east, and wait for a sun they have welcomed more mornings than anyone living can count. Place a hand on stone, and it is cool for a breath, then warm with the day. Put your ear to it, and the wind speaks softly through an architecture of pores and joints. Kush should not be a footnote, it is an axis. It teaches that civilization is a braided river, influences arriving, joining, separating, each branch carrying its own clarity. It insists that queens can hold borders, that iron can define a city as surely as marble, that scripts can keep a nation's soul inside itself without vanishing. It shows pyramids multiplied until they become a rhythm, not a single declaration. By evening, the silhouettes return, sharper now against copper air. The desert cools by degrees. The river speaks in low syllables between stones. Beyond the last chapel, a line of hoofprints crosses a slope and disappears. The mind follows across water and jungle and a continent's long spine to cities that map the sky with a precision that feels like listening. There, calendars wore stone faces, numbers wore feathers, pyramids climbed step by measured step out of forests that sounded like rain. Night collects around the pyramids. The gaze lifts west, over ocean and isthmus, toward the last chapter of this long drift through the impossible. Astronomers who built in limestone and lime, who counted days until time became architecture, who let the sun complete their mathematics at noon, toward the Maya. Chapter 10. The Maya. When time learned to wear stone. In forests where rain writes constantly on leaves, cities rose in measured steps, their edges softened by vines and bird call. Pyramids climbed from limestone platforms toward a sky that arrived humid and near. Plazas opened like clearings in a thought. Stelae stood to mark the seriousness of days. This was a civilization that did not merely count time. It cultivated time, pruned it, trained it to arch across courts and stairways so that sunlight completed mathematics each noon. From Tikal's high temples, the canopy stretches like a green sea. Stone crests, roof combs pierced with windows, catch the earliest light, and howler monkeys provide a chorus deeper than any drum. Far to the west, Palenque sets palaces against a backdrop of waterfalls and pale cliff, its corridors narrow and cool, its stucco once bright as a prayer spoken daily. South and east, Copan raises stelae so intricately carved they seem like woven stories made rigid. The faces on them meet the viewer with the calm of lineage. Across lowlands and foothills, names assemble: Calakmul, Yaxchilan, Uxmal, Caracol, Chichen Itza. Each city keeps its own accent. All speak a language of number, sky, and stone. Their calendars interlocked like gears. A 260-day count, Zolkin, turned within a 365-day year, the Hab, to form cycles that named days with a precision that felt personal. Behind them walked the long count, a ledger that could place an event not simply in season, but in deep chronology. Each date a set of positions in a base 20 rhythm. The invention of zero, a shell sign, empty and full at once, made this possible. Time could be not only recited but calculated, projected forward and backward, made as tangible as corn and stone. Astronomy was not separate from this work. It was its horizon. On stairways and in codices, Venus strides as a clock of war and omen, its synodic cycle tracked in columns of numbers that still hold when checked against the sky. At El Caracol, in Chichen Itza, a round tower sits on a square base and opens slots to directions where planets and solstices announce themselves. Its windows teach wind and light which days matter. At Uxmal, facades catch angles with a tact almost musical. And at Palenque, the sun's passage pins temple doorways to anniversaries written in glyphs just inside. Architecture made these calculations visible. At the equinox, the pyramid of El Castillo at Chichen Itza throws a ripple of triangular shadows down its balustrade until they meet a serpent's head at the stair's base. The illusion arrives and departs in a narrow breath of afternoon, as if a stone snake decided briefly to exist. Clap in the plaza, and the echo that returns from the staircase steps behaves like a bird's cry, an acoustic coincidence sharpened by human attention until it feels like ritual. Across the lowlands, pyramids align with cardinal points, windows frame heliacal risings. Stair counts and terrace counts fold numerology into movement. The cities themselves were acts of water wisdom. In places where rivers hide underground, cenotes, limestone sinkholes, offered clear blue access to the stone's cool memory. Chichen Itza grew around such wells, their surfaces mirroring sky and ceremony. Elsewhere, aguadas, man-made depressions plastered to hold rain, gave reservoirs to plazas. Channels coaxed runoff toward storage. Roofs, courts, and causeways sloped with intention. In the Puig Hills, where surface water is stingy, vaults and cisterns made survival architectural. A city here was also a hydrological instrument. Writing, once a mystery of spirals and animals, now reads in many places with the clarity of voices returned. Glyphs combine syllables and logograms, dates sit beside verbs, names flower with titles and gods. On lintels, stone stairs, and stelae, rulers speak. Births, accessions, alliances, victories, ceremonies that open skin to feed gods with blood, the thread that binds polity to cosmos. The script's beauty is fearless. Even administrative notes look composed for recital. 4 surviving codices, brittle with age but alive, hold tables and rituals, the Dresden among them a ledger of rain and Venus and eclipse that turns ink into forecast. The ball game, an old inheritance carried from earlier cultures, lived here with meanings that range from sport to cosmology. Courts shaped like alleys focus attention on a vertical ring, and players move a heavy rubber ball with hips and shoulders in a choreography severe and exacting. Reliefs and murals make the game's stakes allegorical. Victory and sacrifice sit side by side not as contradiction, but as a thesis about order maintained. Sound in these courts is part of the design. Boundaries tell stories with echo. To walk a Maya city today is to feel both presence and filtration. Heat presses down, lizards flicker over glyphs, roots pry joints apart in slow arguments. Where stucco survives, you see once painted reds and blues. Where it doesn't, the rhythm remains. Stare, platform, stare. A stela's profile against the light. A doorway where, on a day inscribed centuries ago, the sun will still land as promised. Civilization here did not assemble merely from clay to brick to stone. It assembled from observation to inscription to architecture until the sky itself became civic. Weapons and war were not absent. Politics was not gentle. City fought city. Dynasties rose and dimmed. Captives knelt before rulers who wore headdresses high as small trees. But even conflict bends toward record, toward a desire to place deeds inside cycles. Victory mattered as a date, not only an act. The result is a corpus where human ambition, piety, mathematics, and weather coexist on the same stair. And then, the thinning. Not an apocalypse the forest narrates with a single stump, but a pattern scattering. Droughts visit repeatedly, reservoirs run low, crops fail in sequences that test storage and pact alike. Trade routes tilt, warfare tightens into siege and interruption. Courts that once calculated epics calculate rations. Centers depopulate unevenly. Some places keep their breath longer, others fall silent and let green reclaim right angles. The post-classic sees new centers on coasts and lakes, new styles that speak the same language with different stress. Spanish arrivals much later write endings that are not ends. The people remain. Because the Maya never left. Languages multiply and persist. Weaving holds patterns older than many flags. Milpas still rotate maize, beans, and squash in a geometry that feeds both soil and family. Rituals descend in revised forms. Saints cover for gods while sharing their work. Days still carry characters with personalities. Tourists climb stairways snapped free of jungle for a season and call it discovery. For those whose grandparents live near the sites, the stones are not foreign. They are neighbors with long memories. It should not be this advanced so early without iron tools, without beasts of burden on roads, without the wheel employed for freight. And yet here, the mind arranged itself into calendars that converse with planets, into inscriptions that travel securely across centuries, into buildings where the sun completes a calculation forged by human hands. Time in this world is not background. It is a resident deity, housed in observatories and stepped pyramids in folded bark paper. By evening, the forest rises closer. Bats zigzag above plazas emptied of heat. A last red line catches the upper masonry of a temple and goes out. Somewhere a frog begins a measured call and another answers on the off-beat. On a stela's face, a date sits patiently within cartouches, describing an event in a calendar still running. The stone does not hurry the night. It never needed to. The journey has crossed deserts and coasts, plateaus and islands, following tracks left by peoples who assembled cities and ceremonies before our timelines made room for them. Each chapter has pressed the same question into the dust and lifted it again. How did they know so much, so early, so surely? In the hush that follows, as leaves cool and the last birds trace low paths over plazas, an answer approaches that is not an answer, but a way to sit with the question. The cities fade to silhouettes. The story inhales, ready to close. Night has gathered over deserts and forests, over coasts where fog moves in from a dark horizon, and valleys where rivers turn in their sleep. Stones that kept the day's warmth let it go by degrees. Wind rehearses old paths between pillars and down stairways where feet once measured festivals. In the quiet that follows a long journey, the world feels larger and older and near. The roads of this story fold back into the dark, but they do not end. If you return tomorrow, the stones will still be warm. The calendars will still tick in their long, patient cycles. The questions will still be waiting with their familiar kindness. You can walk them again, not to arrive, but to remember. Sleep if you wish, or sit a little longer with what refuses to be ordinary. Either way, the past is not behind you. It is the ground under your feet.